to be acceptable in your sight, our God, our strength, our Redeemer.
Amen.
I want to begin this morning by telling you how great it is to be back here on a Sunday morning. It feels like it's been forever since I've been here. But I want to tell you how grateful I am that I got the opportunity to spend a week vacation with the family in Florida and then a fabulous week of continuing education at Duke Divinity School. It was refreshing, reinvigorating, and hopefully will sustain me until the next time I take some time home. So thank you for that opportunity. If you've been paying attention to our gospel passages over the last 4 Sundays, you may have noticed we've taken kind of a tour of all of the Gospels. If you remember on Easter Sunday, we read Matthew's resurrection account and Matthew's version of the empty tomb. Then the next week, we moved into Luke's Gospel, and we heard, or John's Gospel, I apologize. We moved into John's Gospel, and we heard the story of Doubting Thomas. Now, the Doubting Thomas story is unique to John's Gospel. The other Gospels don't have that story in it. And then last Sunday, we were in Luke's Gospel, where we heard the story of the road to Emmaus. Again, a unique story to that particular evangelist. And now this Sunday, we're back in John's Gospel in chapter 10 for the story of the Good Shepherd. Now, if you didn't know this, the 4th Sunday after Easter, every year, is considered Good Shepherd Sunday. And we get some version of passages as Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And this year, it comes from John's Gospel and Jesus' Good Shepherd discourse. Before we get too deep into that passage, I want to remind everybody where we are in John's Gospel. Because I think setting and context is important, especially with this particular passage. By show of hands, how many of you think this passage is largely incoherent? I'm in that boat, and I'm reaching on it. I had to go do some research. And when we do the research, and when we look at the context of this passage, it becomes more intelligible. So where are we? So if you remember, way back before Easter, we read the story of Jesus healing the man born blind. That's the setting. This is the passage that comes right after that story. So if you remember from that story, Jesus and the disciples are in Jerusalem during the Festival of Booths. And there's a lot of people there because it's a festival. And Jesus has been teaching in the temple complex, and he's been kind of poking and prodding the Pharisees and the religious leaders in the temple. And if you'll recall, they threatened to arrest him at least twice. So Jesus is really kind of riling up the religious leaders, to the point where, in the story of the man born blind, Jesus is walking down this path somewhere in the temple complex. And it's a Sabbath day, and he encounters this man born blind. And he heals him with dirt and spittle. Now, if you remember from that passage, this really infuriated just about everybody, except for the blind man. Because if you'll remember, his parents said, "No, don't ask us if this really happened." The other townspeople said, "Well, it looks like the guy was born blind, but we can't tell. We don't know." And the Pharisees are quizzing Jesus and everybody else because they couldn't wrap their head around the idea that God would have healed on the Sabbath. So that's the setting. That's where we are. Jesus has been healing. Jesus has just healed somebody on the Sabbath. Jesus is now going into one of his long discourses that explains his actions. This particular discourse is called the Good Shepherd Discourse. And it's used to explain why he healed the man born blind. So we start off at the beginning of chapter 10. Jesus said, "Very truly I tell you." This is one of those phrases in John's Gospel that we need to pay particular attention to. The original Greek is Amen, Amen. And we translate it here as "very truly I tell you." Anytime in John's Gospel you read Amen, Amen, or "very truly I tell you," something important is about to happen. Jesus is about to give us a really important teaching. So Jesus says, very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate but climbs in by another way is a thief and a bandit. Jesus, like Jesus does in John's Gospel, is using metaphorical language here. He's creating this metaphor of the people of God being God's flock of sheep. And he talks about the sheepfold, and he talks about the gate. So what he's doing is he's drawing a mental picture. These folks all would have recognized these metaphors. They would have known what a sheepfold looked like. They would have known how a shepherd would have managed their flock. To our 21st century ears, that's kind of foreign. So a little bit of background. A sheepfold is actually an enclosure created to hold sheep. If the stones were available, it would have been made of stone on the bottom layer, and then there would have been a top layer of thistles or briars or some kind of pokey kind of thing to keep predators out. And there would have been one gate. Now, in smaller sheepfolds, the gate would have been left open, and the shepherd would have laid down in that gate to protect the flock from predators. So the metaphor that Jesus is using, he's calling the Pharisees thieves and bandits. He's criticizing the Pharisees for not caring for God's people in the way that God intended it. The man born blind was ostracized from the community, left for nothing, to beg for scraps of food to survive. And Jesus is criticizing the religious elite for allowing that to happen. And in the metaphor, the thieves and the bandits are the ones that aren't caring for God's people. So, we get through this metaphor. Jesus is the shepherd. Now, a little bit more about shepherds, if you didn't know this. Sheep really aren't the most intelligent animal ever, but one of the things that sheep are really good at is recognizing their shepherd. And during this period of time, shepherds would have a particular call that they would use with the sheep. It might have been a word or a sound. But all the sheep of the flock would have recognized the shepherd's call. So in larger sheepfolds that may have been constructed for an entire community and multiple flocks, you would have an intermingling of people's flocks. But when it was time for the shepherd to take the sheep out into pasture to find water and food, the shepherd would call to the sheep, and they would follow him. And the shepherd would lead the large flock out into these pastures and prairie lands for them to eat and to drink. So, Jesus is creating this metaphor. He's the shepherd. He's the one that God's people respond to. He's the one that protects. He's the one that provides. You see how the metaphor starts to take shape then. But the people didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. So he tries to give it another shot, and he changes the metaphor. He says, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. Jesus is the one who protects. Jesus is the one that leads and protects and provides. This is the metaphor. So, in explanation, this discourse is teaching people what it means to be part of that flock. The blind man was not allowed to be part of the flock. The blind man was ostracized. Jesus heals him, makes him whole, brings him into the community, brings him into the flock of followers that he protects and guides. So now we can start to see how this largely incoherent passage starts to make sense. But I have a question. What do sheepfolds have to do with us today? I think Jesus is creating this metaphor. Jesus is creating this metaphor that can speak across time. What if the modern equivalent to the sheepfold that Jesus is talking about is the church? What if the church is that safe space? What if the church is that place where people come for refreshment, rejuvenation, protection, for sanctuary. What if the church was that sheepfold? And Jesus was our shepherd. What if we allowed Jesus? What if we entered into a relationship with Jesus like that of the shepherd and the sheep? Completely dependent on the shepherd for everything, for food, for water, for protection. Jesus tells us in the last verse of this passage why this is so important. Jesus says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. The shepherd provides life and abundant life. But what is abundant life? We can divvy up our lives into multiple categories. We can seek financial security. We can seek societal security. We can seek prominence. We can seek all of these different things in life today. But what Jesus provides, what God provides, is joy, is protection, is all of those things that the shepherd provides the sheep if we allow Jesus to be that in our lives. Sisters and brothers, my prayer for each and every one of us today is that we have ears to hear God's voice in our life and follow Him like the sheep follow their shepherd. Because when we do that, we have life and we have it abundantly. In the name of God, Father, Son,